Welcome to the Social Movements Lab. My name is Michael Hart. I'm currently in Seattle, Washington, and normally in Durham, North Carolina, together with Sandra Omeccihautl, who's in Bologna, Italy. We co-direct the lab. The lab is constructed for a variety of purposes. One is simply to give an introduction to people to movements that are going on in different parts of the world and to understand the importance and significance of those movements. We also try to focus on the figure of the activist scholar, by which we mean not so much students and professors who become activists, but really the kinds of intellectual production and the people who are doing that intellectual production within movements themselves. The lab was originally sponsored by the Duke Franklin Humanities Institute, and now it has been for a few years now has been sponsored by Red May, and we're very grateful for them. If you haven't seen it, you might check out the last installment of the lab about the current movements in Iran. You'll find them on the Red May website, and also on the Red May website, you'll find other interesting material. If these kinds of broadcasts interest you, I'm sure you'll find other things on the Red May website that do too. So for today's discussion, we're going to be talking about the abortion access and abortion aid movements in Mexico in recent years with Amy Krauss, whom we'll be talking with for the first half hour, and then Oriana López Uribe will join the discussion. I just wanted to mention one other thing that I forgot. Two of our other sponsors are in Italy, Dinamo Press and Euronomade, and we're grateful to them for co-sponsoring the lab. So, Sandro and Amy, I wanted to begin first. Amy, thank you, by asking you if you could give a description for people who have no experience with or understanding of what the movements in Mexico have been doing, about what the movements have been doing in terms of abortion access, how they function, the process of acompañantes. Yeah, I think it'd be helpful just to give a first introduction before we start discussing what's interesting.
Sure, yes. So first, I just want to say that I'm an anthropologist, and so I was doing field work with the accompaniment movement, working closely with Oriana, starting in 2009, and haven't been back until 2019. Just to kind of, as we think about scholar activism, how we are on these different time scales, and I think the movement is changing so rapidly. Accompaniment in Mexico City and the people that I was working with emerged after the decriminalization of abortion in 2007, only in Mexico City, which kind of triggered other states to intensify criminal laws they already had on the books. Some states changed constitutions to recognize that life begins at the moment of conception. Which kind of enabled the legal scaffolding around policing in public healthcare spaces. And this coincided also with the availability of misoprostol, which is a pharmaceutical drug which can be taken in different phases of pregnancy to cause contractions and to cause an abortion. So people were often buying the pills in pharmacies and going to hospitals in cases where they weren't sure how much they should be bleeding or what the process of abortion should exactly look like. And so acompañantes were doing two things. They were both trying to expand access to legal abortion care, which was becoming available in Mexico City. I mean, the law changes, but then there's a long process of building the public health services. So they were also involved in giving feedback to what public health services should look like around legal abortion, trying to help people traveled to the city from states where it was criminalized. And they were also, I think, doing this crucial work around giving people the tools and information about how to protect themselves in this healthcare policing nexus that was emerging around the fact that it was legal in Mexico City, criminalized in other states, and that pharmaceuticals were widely available. And the accompanying movement has grown tremendously across the region of Latin America. And we can, I guess, talk more about that, but that's just the basic part from my perspective.
That's awesome. And one of the things I thought it'd be useful to emphasize is the sort of dual route going on, how the legalization of abortion and the working through the state is one way in which abortion has become more available in various Latin American countries. And that's, I think, mostly what one focuses on is the legal gains in the courts or the legislature in different countries. And going along with that, what you're describing, which seems fascinating to me, is more of a grassroots and activist route that works together within the legal framework, but is actually very separate from the institutions, like you say, the healthcare institutions of the state. And could you just say a little bit more about that dual nature of this, the two kinds of struggle?
Yeah. So I think that's kind of what's most powerful and radical about the accompaniment movement is that it is kind of growing alongside advancements in legal recognition of rights, and kind of maintains a certain amount of skepticism about what those rights will actually mean in practice. And Oriana can probably speak more to this. I've learned a lot about this kind of the way that they're orienting their political goals from her, but that it is not premised or solely oriented to legal change. And there's a lot of debates between people working in the domain of acompañamiento, which is kind of like the reproductive labor of the social movement, and the people who are doing legal advocacy work, who are strategizing on imagining what kind of state we're building by passing legislations, and down to the very strategy of how you word the law, what will that enable in terms of healthcare practice, et cetera. But that this movement also exists as something, whether or not the law recognizes the right to abortion or not, and that it crosses the borders of jurisdiction between spaces where it's legally recognized and where it's criminalized, is really powerful. And people in the US have kind of located this or noticed it and are calling it autonomous health movements. So connecting it to like the Black Panther health clinics, free clinics, or the Jane Underground Collective that was practicing abortions in Chicago before Roe v. Wade. And I think that's kind of a helpful framework because it also shifts from the public health approach of efficacy, that is to say, like, are people able to get safe abortions or not, to a question of what kinds of relationships are being created by the movement itself. So it's not just about doing the interruption of pregnancy, but it's also about generating a kind of relationship between people that differs from the one that happens in a state-funded clinic.
Yes, Amy, since you started to accompany the accompañantes in 2009, the situation changed quite significantly in Mexico as well as in Latin America. We have now, let's say, a new wave of feminist mobilizations for several years. And these new waves of feminist mobilization have kind of changed the way in which feminism is perceived and enacted in many Latin American countries, including Mexico. So my question is about the relation between the acompañantes and the new feminist configuration in Mexico and in Latin America.
Yes, I mean, I think a really important dimension of the accompaniment movement in relationship to this new wave of feminism across Latin America is this kind of experience with and frustration with gender developmentalism. It makes me think of the way one of our friends in the accompaniment organization that I was working with Oriana, described moving into working with Fondo MARIA, which is the abortion fund of acompañantes that I was working with, from an NGO-funded clinic. And this was after the legalization, and she was saying that there was this discourse of rights and empowerment that was officially the language of the clinic, but that really they were under a certain amount of pressure to reach the number of a target number of people who had had abortions in a given day, and that their workloads, they would stay too late for work, having to achieve those target numbers, and at the same time, the atmosphere of the clinic was still permeated by this moral stigma where the physician was doing a favor for the person who was seeking care. And that, moving into the accompaniment organization was a necessity from that experience. So it wasn't just because she believed in reproductive rights, but also because her own laboring conditions were kind of harnessed to this gender developmental framework in a certain way that wasn't a nourishing, livable work life for her. So, that's like a really kind of detailed or small, fine-grained instance of, I think, the way those connections can emerge. And then another aspect of it, I think, is the linkage between this very explicit sort of connection of thinking about abortion prohibition and criminalization as a form of state violence, connected to impunity around femicide and the devaluation of feminine lives in general and feminine labor in general. And that linkage is very powerful for like putting pressure on this politics of life that kind of symbolizes the fetus as something that can be extracted from a context where life beyond like biological survival is becoming difficult to live. And in that sense, I think this Latin American movement has a lot to speak back to the US. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, definitely the relationships to the US are really, really interesting. And I'm sure people in the US watching this recognize them immediately. Something I wanted to just back up with, because I feel like I might not have pursued further enough earlier, which is just, could you describe a little bit more what that acompañantes actually do and why they're necessary? I mean, someone might think, okay, misoprostol's available, you can get it. Why can't women just, do it on their own? Why is an acompañante necessary, and what does an acompañante do just in practical terms?
Yeah. Well, with using misoprostol, people have developed a protocol, let's say, for how to use it, what to expect through experimentation. So I think what's been essential and continues to be essential about acompañamiento through that process is the sharing of that experimentation and the kind of exchange of information and training one another about how to be attuned to the process outside of an official healthcare setting. And then I think there's a whole element, and this kind of goes into the part of thinking about the kinds of relationships that are made through the practice, which goes beyond, people's safety, which is important aspect of it. And I think that has to do with really this kind of political commitment to needing an abortion and practicing abortion as a shared experience, and that shared experience can't be assumed, but has to be trained and cultivated. It becomes a kind of technique for how to relate to one another, and it's not sentimental empathy, right? It's a kind of practice of understanding someone's needs that may differ from yours. And it's actually, there's an artfulness to it that is very similar to doula training and all those aspects. I mean, going through an abortion can be a painful experience on varying levels. And I think this kind of collective training about how to attune to one another without subsuming that into a kind of rescue narrative or we all feel the same way is actually a really critical praxis that has emerged from having to experiment, basically.
Another question refers to accompanying as a practice of mobility. And of course, there are other challenging practices of mobility that cross the Mexican territory, and I'm thinking of movements of migration.
Yeah.
What strikes me is that also among activists accompanying movements of migration, there are references to the politics of life, to the question of acuerpamiento, kind of politics of the body, of the gathering of bodies. And unfortunately, the question of abortion is kind of important also with respect to these movements because of rape, basically.
Yeah.
So my question is whether there are connections among the two different movements I just mentioned, and if there is a kind of conversation about the problems that characterize the condition of female migrants, in particular in Mexico, undocumented female migrants.
Yes. I think, I hope that Oriana can speak to that more. I think in terms of Mexico City, that the number of people migrating through Mexico City as a kind of place on their way to the US-Mexico border has increased. And I don't know how much that has shaped accompaniment practices in Fondo MARIA. But what you bring up makes me think also about the US-Mexico border and all of the funds that work in similar ways to funds in Mexico City, but in the condition of border crossing. And that's, in addition to, so that also pushes us to think beyond the kind of legal landscape in terms of whether or not rights are enshrined in law, but think about what the kinds of vulnerabilities that are brought into play as people move through different political, economic, and legal regimes. So yes, I think that that's a major part of the kind of border work that's happening between US and Mexico with abortion funds. And now as Texas has moved towards this kind of extreme policing techniques for accompaniment and mutual aid, that, you know, crossing towards the other direction, towards Mexico, has become a necessary political possibility for people. So yeah, I think that's kind of an emergent problem, specifically on the national border between US and Mexico. And I hope that maybe Oriana can speak more about how it's emerging in Mexico City.
I'm continuing to think a little bit about something that Sandro and Amy were saying a few minutes ago, about a kind of, not dichotomy, but dual strategy, let's say, you know, about movements that are facing the state and asking for legal transformations, and movements that are, in a way, turn their back to the state and are constructing autonomous networks. I'm putting it obviously too strongly in this, and that usually the two are mixed, but I'm wondering the extent to which, I mean, and this is what I think Sandra was getting at before too, is that in various movements feminist movements throughout Latin America, there is that mix in each of these movements. You know, the demanding transformations of the state, legal transformations, rights, and constructing autonomous networks of transformation. I wonder to the extent, it seems to me, Amy, that the way the accompaniment movement in Mexico here, especially with regard to misoprostol, et cetera, is really primarily on the side of the autonomous movement not facing the state and not relying primarily on legal transformations or making demands on the state. Is that the way you am I understanding that right, or maybe I'm putting too much weight on the one side of this in this case?
I mean, I don't think you're putting too much weight on it. I think it's really important, but they are entangled in a certain way. So, for example, the accompaniment organization in Mexico City also provides materials to the public clinics and maintains relationships with politicians, and you know, necessarily builds its space of political power and agency in relationship to those structures. So it's kind of like one foot in, one foot out. But I think it's a matter of what becomes the principle of organization. So we engage with law so that we might build a space that enables us to support and care for one another in a certain way. We don't engage with law so that, because we care that much about state recognition. And that's crucial, I think, and kind of hard to put into practice over decades, but they do. I kind of want to go back to the question about rape and the accompaniment movements, because I mean, and thinking about law specifically, there's a history of abortion legality functioning in relationship to exception. So criminalized in all circumstances, unless in the case of rape or in the case of fetal malformation. And rape as an exception in Mexico, and I think in a lot of Latin American contexts, has kind of gathers moral consensus, moral and political consensus in a certain way, that does produce a kind of image of the victim subject, right? That one gains access through this victim status. So it's been important for the struggle to kind of problematize that exceptional notion of why somebody should access abortion. And yet at the same time, it's a really prevalent dimension of people's experience. And so I just want to flag that tension between the kinds of political public discourses that are available around rape and how people actually are able to respond to it as a material condition of needing to end pregnancy.
And so in some ways you're saying that the use of rape as an exception in some ways might preserve or even reinforce the stigma to someone who gets an abortion without being raped. You know, that it has a kind of rebound effect or something like that.
Yes.
Right. That totally makes sense. That's interesting. And you know, you're also saying, like you were saying earlier, that we have to see the abortion access movement and the acompañantes in the context of struggles against femicide, against sexual violence, that it's all part of one fabric in Mexico, and then of course in Latin America and elsewhere. And that does seem really important to me. Yeah.
Yeah. And that similarly has a tension in the legal realm because of the problem, you know, there's a lot of kind of friction within feminist movements in Mexico about whether or not growing the criminal legal system to respond to femicide is the way we want to imagine the state. And so, right, it has a similar kind of...
Maybe the issue of rape figures differently in the case of Mexican women and in the case of illegalized migrant women.
Go on, Sandra.
Yeah.
I mean, I see what you mean, but just say a little bit more.
Yes, in the case of migrant women, it is not really acknowledged because migrant women tend not to be considered in their individuality when they are illegalized. You know, so it's quite difficult to make a legal case around them, precisely because they are part of a mass, you know, of kind of anonymous mass. So it's well known that migrant women from Central America take a contraceptive pill before crossing the southern Mexican border, because rape is really kind of common, you know, there. And so it's a kind of preemptive way to avoid pregnancy, of course.
Right. I think this might be a good time to add Oriana to the discussion, as long as the internet connection holds up well. I should say, which I forgot to say at first, that Amy is joining us from Chicago, but normally based in Santa Cruz. Oriana is joining us from Oaxaca, but normally based in Mexico City. Around the holidays, everyone's all in different places. So, Oriana, I'm glad this is the connection seems to be working great. And I wanted, I mean, I was wondering if you could even start by saying more about the functions, the practical functions of the acompañantes movement, both in its, let's say, medical practice, but also in its social and affective practice, you know, around the construction of relations against the stigma of abortion, the kinds of, like, what the accompaniment does. It seems to me it's at least dual, you know, because one is about safety, medication, health questions, and the other is a social affective relation. And I thought maybe you could help just clarify or say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that abortion is not only about the medical procedure, but it has to do with what is it around, right? Like the idea is that the acompañantes are able to translate what the medical manuals say and the guidelines from the the World Health Organization and all these kind of things. And it translates the technical part, but there's this part of an emotional and social support, as you were saying, because society, communities are not coming together to support women when they need to face abortions, or people that are pregnant that need an abortion and do not identify as women. It's a moment where you cannot ask for your neighbor to give you support. You would go to your neighbor if you were having a kidney transplant or anything else that relates to your health, but not for abortion, because you don't know how your neighbor is gonna feel about that, because there's a lot of stigma around that. So in this case, the acompañantes are there to tell them that there are strangers across the country and across the world, basically, that we are there for them and that we support their decision, and we know that they can make the right decision for them at that moment. And I mean, at every moment, but you know, like that specific decision in that particular moment. and that we're there for her or for them as they need. And that is very important into changing the narrative around abortion, that you're supposed to be bad, or you're supposed to keep it a secret, or you're, because, and then it's not only about that being for them in the case of this procedure, but also like validating their ability to make choices in general, and to also talk through, because there are many things that are happening around abortion that is not the procedure itself. It's a lot of things that happen with struggles with the relationships, like a lot of submissiveness, or this kind of other, and poverty and lack of social support in general. And even there's women that have told us like that nobody has ever listened to them when they go to the doctor. Like the idea of having an acompañante just to listen and really listen to what they're saying is something that they appreciate a lot. I mean, we all appreciate to be listened to, right? So the idea is that we are facing a lot of violences, institutional violences all the time. But I think that there's also one other part, an extra layer of what the acompañantes movement is doing, that has to do with the feminist movement or the abortion movement itself. Because many of the abortion movements or many feminist organizations that are working for legalization of abortion or decriminalization of abortion, they do not have the first experience on like abortion itself. They have it on their own, but they don't see it as a social thing, and understand the procedure itself and the access barriers that exist. So there's another layer of what the acompañantes movement is doing in terms of showing to the rest of the movement what abortion access looks like and should look like. And I think that's something that we learn in the Maria Fund, because as Amy said, we started doing it when the Mexico City law passed. But we saw very clear that this was needed, not only because the rest of the states were not legal yet, because that's what our idea was, like, until the rest of the states come to this legalization, then we're going to be here, and then when everywhere is legal, then we're going to stop. And that's not true, because the social part is super important. And so even when it's legal, it's really hard to access the information on how to get there. It's really hard to do anything else. Like even like having people taking care of your children, etc., is really hard when you're facing such a stigmatized procedure. And then so we figured that out, that even that the acompañamiento it's even more than just getting to a clinic. Like it's getting the information and the pills necessarily, which is something that is happening. I mean, I'm working on abortion not only in Mexico, so this is something that the acompañantes movement do across the world, is also getting the pills, because even though in Mexico is widely available, in the rest of the countries is not that easy to access. So acompañantes movement is figuring out ways where people can get the right pills in the right moment in their hands. So that is really important also as part of what the movement is doing, is making sure that we can access quality medication to have abortions, and that we have all the information there. Because what we have learned about abortion has come from soap operas, from like very bad movies and very old movies. Like even The Godfather, like has this terrible scene about what abortion is, and it's like, and I mean it's not showing any scene, but just having the social charge that comes with abortion. But we have learned from like Dirty Dancing and all these kind of things that abortion is something that has lots and lots of blood, that you might die of. And this is the idea where people are coming to have an abortion, like as if it was the last resource, and that they were almost willing to die rather than, and instead of it being a choice and a normal social family health choice, or like an individual choice, it's just becoming this charge of like, it's almost like death or life kind of situation. It's just like, I'm going to have an abortion because I really, really, really cannot. Instead of seeing it like a normal procedure and a normal choice where you're not going to die, you're going to be supported, you're going to be fine. You're just having an abortion because you need one right now. And that is still not the case. That's not how we see it still. Sorry, Michael.
I mean, that's great. Let me just, because it's my usual way of thinking. I just wanted to clarify, because I think you added things. I was posing 2, and you really came back with 4 functions of the acompañantes. I just wanted to clarify. I mean, the first is say medical health one, which is the clearest one. What to expect, how it works, what not to do, etc. The second one is the material support, which you were emphasizing, which is great. Like, who's going to take care of my kids? How can I get to the clinic? What I have to pay for. The third one is the emotional support. I mean, that because people need being together, etc. And then that fourth one is I'm fascinated by, which is you're saying you called it the social one, which is really transforming how people see, also within the feminist movement, what abortion is. Seeing it's just a procedure. So it's not just a question there. I mean, it's partly a question there of removing the stigma, also a question of removing the horrific apocalyptic images of what it involves. But it's almost like a social education process. Just
Yes.
teaching what it is. Okay. Anyway, it's helpful for me to even individuate all the different things that are being done by that by the movement at the same time. Sorry, you all. When I do that, I feel like I interrupt the discussion because I wanted to clarify for myself.
But so regarding,
No, it's good.
Yeah. Go ahead, Sandra.
Fourth function that Michael was highlighting, the social dimension of the movement. Do relations with the women that you accompany and support remain? Are there many of those women who become part of the movement?
That is something that it's what we want, and we're always working towards that. It's really hard to say that we are able to do that with everyone, because like it's a personal process. You sometimes need a space, and you go back. With the Maria Fund, we have done some studies, and people do stay. I mean, like, some people were already part of the social movement anyway, and some people also start then relating to abortion movement. I think specifically in Latin America, with the Marea Verde, which is like the green tide of the green handkerchief and these kind of things, there's been a lot of I don't know, like a momentum of people just like jumping into the abortion movement, and that has been amazing. And and this is definitely one of the things that we see as part of our accompaniment, is how the acompañamiento, how do we make sure that if they want to become activists, that they see the injustices in the world and they want to act on it, and so how do we receive them? And some of the things that we have been doing is, I mean, like, the Maria Fund in particular is like kind of a mixed animal of like the abortion funds in the US, but also the accompaniment networks in Latin America and the rest of the global South. And we're partially institutional, but also against institutions. So we're like a little bit of a weird animal. But one of the things that we know is that we need to improve the way that the feminist movement is working in Mexico, in terms of, I think that sometimes, and especially in Mexico City, it can be really snub. And it's really hard for the Maria Fund to support women's activists when they're not based in Mexico City, because our main focus is support them from outside Mexico City. But from the US, we have learned to do this kind of like spaces, the speak out sessions, where they can talk about their abortions and like decompress, because then it's a lot of a stigma that we're carrying around on abortion. So we're in a layer of like destigmatizing everything around that, to be able to also move freely, and not only being part of the abortion movement, but also seeing the other injustices. Because as I said, when you're facing an abortion, like when you take out the abortion, which is the easiest part for us because we're an abortion fund, then you see all the inequalities that people are facing that are beyond access to sexual and reproductive health services.
Well, I have a question that it reorients things a little bit, but you've been referring, Oriana, to accompaniment movements in other countries, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that. Partly because some of the people watching this will be in the U.S., and where the situation, of course, is quite dramatic. Also, in other Latin American countries, can you say a little bit more about the breadth of extension of this and the way it functions in different countries?
The way it functions, I mean, it changes. Every collective and every network or every organization of accompaniment is going to work different. We are part of the Red Compañera, which is a regional network of feminist accompaniment, and we are from the Patagonia, from Tijuana. You know, like we have all the that part of the Americas covered. And now you can see that there's this collaboration happening with the US, like with what's happening right now in their context. In Europe, there's one thing that's called, there's this network called Abortion Without Borders, and basically they are supporting people from Eastern Europe to come to Western Europe, and like all this, and from Ireland to the UK. And so that there's that. In Indonesia, there's also an abortion support network. There's many different. In Africa, there's the Mama Network, which is a regional network that is also like organizing the people that are providing acompañamiento in different parts of Africa. So I think that, and so for me, there's this massive global thing happening where we know that and this is one thing, we do want abortion to be decriminalized. We want abortion to be legalized. But people are having abortions right now, and they need to have the best abortions that they can get. So that's what we're doing right now. So it's a little bit of everything in terms of like, we are pushing for better laws. We are pushing for better public programs, but still there's people that need right now to have abortion. So we're doing that social program right now. And so it's, yeah, and it's amazing. There's organizations like Women Help Women that are working from Europe, but they are supporting everyone in the globe to get access to the pills as well. Right now, what is happening with Access Aid in the US, like the thing is how to, and it's a revolution in itself. Like abortion with pills is a revolution. Why is this not available over the counter everywhere? We should be able to have that on our own, like medicine supply in the cabinet in our homes, because this is something that we need, and that we need to know, and that we need to learn. Like as much as they want us to learn how to use a condom, why are we not using this as something that can gain control of our lives? And this has to do with stigma. So that's why we're also working on this. How do we change the narrative around abortion? Abortion it's a decision that people have made for centuries, and we're putting all this stigma because of morality and things that are not necessarily what is something that is decided by each person, and it has to do with each person's values. It doesn't have to do with politics, like a public set of the agenda.
Could you say a little bit more about the let's say practical matters of misoprostol? So we have first of all, we have a question about access, like you said, and that is in some places resolved, in many places not. But but it's also, of course, the case that there has to be some instruction, that it's not a completely do it yourself thing. So maybe with people who are unfamiliar with how misoprostol works and how the questions, could you just say a little bit more about, because as you say, it's a super exciting, like if one thinks about the relation of 50 years ago, that this is, a safe and easily available and hard to restrict method. Yeah. So could you just say a little more about what, I don't mean how it works medically, but how it works in the context of the acompañantes. Like, why do you need someone who advises you? What does one have to think about? How complicated is it? I guess I partly want to have people who haven't thought about this before just think, wow, that's awesome. Like why is that not happening everywhere? Like, just like you were saying. So
Yeah.
say a little bit more about what are the difficulties and dangers? What is the actual?
Yeah, there's not much difficulties and dangers. I think that it is more about being chill and knowing that what you're going through is normal.
Mhm.
And this is why I was saying about these movies, like from the movies and from the soap operas and all these things, we learned that there's going to be thousands of liters of blood coming out. So when it's not, because abortion is not like that, it's more like a heavy menstruation than like a heavy period than and a hemorrhage. And if it's a hemorrhage, you need to go to the hospital. Like if it's going, and if you see that it's coming out, like if you had opened the tap water and that's the way that you're bleeding, you need to run to the hospital. Like, but then knowing these kind of things is not something that we have been educated about.
Mhm.
So since we don't have that information, that should be, and this is something that, because for me is struggling. Like, there is a lot of people that are having miscarriages in the first trimester. Nobody is explaining to them what's happening with a miscarriage, but a miscarriage and an abortion with pills is going to be very similar. So even, I mean, I think that this should be something that we learn, all of us, because at some point we might get pregnant. It's really like reasonable if we get pregnant, and it might be that we get a miscarriage. Even if we don't get an abortion, it might be that we get a miscarriage. And we need to learn how to see those kind of like what is an emergency and what is normal. So what we teach them is how to see what a normal bleeding is like, and what a heavy bleeding is like, and so they need to have a plan ahead, so they know how to get to the closest emergency hospital close to them. They need to be there, and depending on their health, it needs to be like either like top an hour, and if not, if they have anemia or if they have something else, it might be 30 minutes, just to be safer on that side. That they need to be with somebody there physically to support them into getting there, like, and then they need to have, it's a lot of practicalities. You need to have cash in case you need a taxi. You need to have, like, or somebody else driving, or these kind of things, and you need to be even awake. Sometimes it's about the time. Like, you're not taking these pills when you're going to bed, because you need to be there, like, checking on how this is going. These kind of things that are really practical, like checking your temperature, things that are going to be normal, because of there's some secondary effects with the medicine, and it depends on the doses that you have. If you have mifepristone, then your doses of misoprostol is going to be much lower, and then you're going to have less secondary effects. I can go into these details, but also if you're in a second trimester or in a third trimester, it's going to be better if the acompañante is going to be there with you. And then you need to prepare yourself of what you're going to see, because it's not the same thing that you're going to see in the first trimester that you're going to see in the second trimester, even late second trimester. And you need to be prepared in that case, and sometimes you need to be like, sometimes even like inside the hospital. It depends on the country that you are, even in the city that you are, or in the town that you are, to make a plan on how that's going to happen. But that's the thing, like, because at the beginning there was a lot of I don't know how to say it, like a resistance into having abortion with acompañantes instead of a doctor. And we're like, yeah, but people are having miscarriages, and there's nobody there. Like, like, they're not prepared. You're not preparing anyone for this. And still we're surviving that. So it's also about this matter of trusting that people are gonna know when they need to go to the hospital, or if they can stay home and just deal with the things. Many of the things, I mean, the main thing that we're gonna deal with is cramps, and we have been dealing with menstrual cramps all our lives. So that is something. I mean, even if it's usually not that hard, we still have seen and supported friends going through very hard cramps. So we know what to do. We know how to use the hot waters. We know how to give massages. We're now using. There's a lot of people in Latin America that are using herbs to support abortion with pills, which is kind of like like a mix of before midwives were doing abortions with herbs, and now we're using the same medicine herbs to ease the abortion process with pills. So
in order to ease the cramps, in order to make the cramps less. That makes sense.
The cramps, the anxiety, like there's a lot of things that are happening at the same time. There's a lot of fear, because, as I said, like, people think that they're coming to this and they might die. So this kind of like just like easing down and being able to, I mean, and that's one part. Like, if your body is like super tense, the abortion is going to be much harder. So there's a part of relaxing that needs to happen, and that relaxing can happen also with certainties and understanding everything that's been said to you. And that's something that's not happening at the medical facility, right? Like, the physicians love to talk in this lingo that nobody understands. And it's really hard to like let loose when you're not understanding what they're saying. Sorry for the word.
I think it's okay for us. Amy, you've been you've been traveling across. You're one who works both in the U.S. and in Mexico, and I was wondering, you have in some ways privileged perspective about what the experiences of the movements in Mexico, and I suppose Latin America in general, but specifically this acompañantes movement in Mexico and the use misoprostol. How do you see that from the U.S. perspective? You know, especially since the illegalization of abortion in many parts of the country in the last months.
Yeah. Well, I think a major thing that we can learn in the U.S. around accompaniment with misoprostol is the way movements in Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America have really collectivized or shared the risk of practicing abortion outside of a legal context. And it's really hard in the US because people who are acting in this domain of accompaniment are much more kind of bound with the idea of like, this is my boundary of what I can do without risking myself to possible prosecution, right? So it becomes this kind of contractual affair of like, what are you willing to risk versus what am I willing to risk? And I think that's kind of an obstacle to doing the kind of, for a movement like the one that emerges in Mexico and Latin America, to really come to fruition here. And I think it has to do with our history and relationship to law and the state, and like this kind of repertoire, I guess, or histories of moving together against the law in Mexico that we can learn from. And with misoprostol, I think it's really important in the US also, pharmaceuticals, you know, are so intensely controlled. So I think the outcomes are going to be really different around how people are organizing.
About access to misoprostol and the way that affects it. And what you were saying just a minute ago, just to come back to the very beginning of our discussion, that in some ways like you were describing earlier, the acompañantes movement as a combination of focusing on legal and state questions and also being an autonomously organized movement. And in some ways, I think that what you were saying, and it seems, I mean, of course, things in the US, it's such a varied country that can't make exact generalizations, but that there's a lot of focus on the legal referring to the state part of it, and perhaps less of a, at the moment, at least in the months since the end of Roe v. Wade, less of a construction of autonomous organizing that turns its face away from the state. But it's interesting. It's one of the things that I take from both of your work on the acompañantes movement is that the need for the intersection or intertwining of the both demanding rights from the state and legal and safe procedures and the construction of autonomous and organizing that goes together with that.
But I think that it's a different context because of the US in terms of, I think that there's people organizing in the US, but it's going to be really hard for them to come up and say we're getting organized because it is a very strong state. And, you know, like the consequences of being like against the law in the States are very different. And like you guys haven't even signed the Human Rights Declaration. So these kind of things that are, you know, very, which is what protects us, and we are able to talk about what we do in a context and with a specific security measures. But the kind of security measures that people on the ground in the US need to take to do this kind of work, it's part of that is not talking about that and being really, really, have a lot of secrecy around what they're doing, being very discreet, so that they don't become like this kind of a threat to the law empowerment. So I think that it is a really difficult and different context. And there's been a lot of news about Mexico supporting the US that can be problematic in that sense, because it's turning on some red lights for the state, and that's going to be a lot harder for local activists in the US to keep doing it. So I'm just saying.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that's important, and recognizing the powers of criminalization in the U.S. and the threats. But I still think it's very important to take inspiration, both practically and then even just political inspiration from what's been accomplished elsewhere, and of course there would have to be a translation process is the way I think of it. And that's really Sandro's way of thinking about it, too. The kind of translation process is not a language one, but a translation of tactics, translation methods. But those translations are often necessary. I mean, the way movements travel is partly in that.
And definitely the abortion movement has been translating to say that, like, for several years. We saw from the beginning when Texas started like restricting abortion and shutting down the clinics. From that moment, like Mexico's activists have been working with people from the US into like navigating this and what it meant and how to, like little by little remove these barriers of like, I don't know how to say it, but like having learning how to resist. Yeah.
The way that is also the need to translate the abortion movement onto different contexts, and I mean, kind of difficult but interesting mix between, let's say, autonomy on the one hand and legality. I think it's a kind of important thing also beyond, the kind of very interesting experience that we have been discussing. Yeah.
Right. Well, also, Sandro, that's another way of saying something that you were bringing up 45 minutes ago, which is in some ways that the transversal connection between acompañantes in the abortion context and the essentially acompañantes in the migrant context. Mexicans and also people in other parts of the world who are performing a kind of migrant aid and things. It's making that translation transversal ones.
Yes, in Mexico it is particularly interesting, because I was kind of struck by the resonances between the experiences and the languages. And in a way, also activists accompanying movements of illegalized migration in Mexico are trying to build structures, autonomous structures, as the one we have discussed earlier, with dimensions that are not that different from the four ones that you were highlighting before, Michael.
That's really interesting.
That's interesting, yeah.
This might be a good point for us to stop. I'm always conscious of the hour mark. For those who are watching, I would say look at the side, and we'll have information. If anyone watching wants to get involved in some of the acompañantes movements in different countries, we'll have some access information on the side of the screen that we'll put together. So I wanted to thank especially Oriana and Amy for joining us. This was really great. Really great discussion.
Thank you for having us, for the invitation.
Yeah.